center issue in discussing the flood, in discussing the problems of the flood, and discussing the answers to these problems that have been brought up about the flood, basically is found in the ark itself. So with that in mind, we want to look at three verses 14 through 16 here, and look at the whole ark and all that is said about it. And we don't have very much. We just got three verses here that give us some material concerning the ark and exactly what it looked like. Doesn't even resemble your conception of the ark in the picture that I brought several weeks ago, because the ark was not a streamlined vessel designed for speed. It was a flat-bottomed vessel designed simply to maintain itself upon the face of very, very turbulent waters. All it had to do was float. That's all that God asked, and that's all that Noah needed of the ark, was that the thing would float. Don't sink and don't turn over. Float and we'll make it. But go anywhere, they didn't need to go anywhere. Now, they were taken somewhere. They were taken all the way up into Turkey. But they didn't really need to go anywhere. All they needed to do was stay on top and don't sink. Verses 14 through 16 of chapter 6. You probably remember it's been many weeks ago since we ended with verse 13. We're looking at this verse by verse. And the last time that we dealt with the passages here, going from one verse to another, was a long time ago, and we ended with verse 13, which gave us some of, I believe, the preparatory steps for the flood. Since that time, we've just been discussing the flood in general, some of the arguments for the flood, some of the history of belief concerning the extent of the flood, and a variety of other things. We've been using several verses in chapters 6, 7, and 8. I don't think we've really gotten, well, we got into 9 because we talked about the rainbow over there in chapter 9. But we haven't been going along in order, in numerical order, so we're going to start again tonight with where we left off, which is back here in verse 14. All these three verses give us, and I don't mean all in the sense that it's not exciting or important, it's just that we don't have very much space given to this particular subject, and that is a description of what the ark looked like. Only way that we can hope to come to some understanding of the ark and its size and its potential carrying capacity is by studying these three verses. So we'll read through them and we'll come back and comment on them, and if we get through, then we can go to some other things, but it'll take us a while this evening just to look here at the ark and some very interesting features that that are found right here in these verses, but that a lot of people don't see. And the Lord's just given us some things here, just some things that you won't find in books anywhere, to help make it more understandable, so you can picture in your mind what the ark was like. Verse 14. I mean, people think they get revelation on things. It's interesting to get revelation on the ark, on what the ark looked like. I mean, if God could give the Apostle John a vision of several thousand years of church history and the millennium and the eternal state, why couldn't he give someone a vision of what the ark looked like? Amen. Hallelujah. I'm not claiming I had that vision. No, I'm just saying, why couldn't God do something like that? Amen. But I know some things about the ark that I didn't read in any book, so I know where I got that. I mean, in any book about boats. So I know where I got that. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Gopher, you know what a gopher is. Room shalt thou make. Isn't that the animal that lives around here? Yeah. And we don't have those down south. We saw those when we first came up here, and it was kind of a cross between a squirrel and a chipmunk. And I didn't know what the thing was. It's a gopher. So we've got gopher wood here. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Only place in the Bible that word appears. Room shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make in the ark, and in the cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. Now I guess the first thing to point out and to emphasize here is the fact that he is getting these directions concerning the construction and concerning the dimensions of the ark directly from God himself. So it's, you see, God's talking back in verse 13, and God said to Noah. And when you get down to verse 14, God's still talking, make thee an ark. So to paint pictures of the ark that are out of reality and that do injustice to the biblical record is an affront against God, because he's the one that gave the directions to build this box in the first place. So people that want to paint fanciful notions of this little boat and how the animals couldn't fit in there, remember, God's the one who's giving the directions here. Amen. It's very similar, if you'll turn over to Exodus chapter 25, to another ark that the Old Testament speaks of. Chapter 25 of Exodus, verses 9 through 11. Two important arks in the Old Testament. One's in Genesis 6, and one we have introduced to us with a lot more description, by the way, here in Exodus 25. Now, verse 1, the Lord spake to Moses, saying, so we're several millennia later now. And he spake to Noah. And it's interesting that the critics that want to find problems with Noah and his boat and his ark, and it's described in similar language to what we'll see here in Exodus 25. They don't have any problems with the ark here in chapter 25 of Exodus. And it's given in very similar language. God himself speaks to the man, gives him the dimensions, and says, now I want you to make it after this fashion. But it's interesting that the critics don't have any problem with the Ark of the Covenant here in Exodus. They've got a problem with Noah's Ark. Verse 9, according to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle, and the pattern of all the instruments thereof, even so shall ye make it. And thou shalt make an ark of shittim wood. 2 cubits and a half shall be the length thereof, 1 cubit and a half the breadth thereof, and 1 cubit and a half the height thereof. Now you see, this reads very similar. Of course, you've got different wood, different dimensions, different purposes, and so forth. But it reads very similar. He said back in Genesis 6, verse 15, this is the fashion that you shall make the ark of. He says here in Exodus 25, verse 9, here's the pattern that I want you to make everything after. And he goes into verse 10 by saying, now make this ark of shittim wood. He gives them the measurements of it, how high, how deep, how long it is. The same thing with the ark over here, how long, how high, how wide the thing is, the very same thing. Verse 11, thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, within and without shalt thou overlay it, and make a crown of gold round about it. Back to Genesis 6:14, thou shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. So we got a very similar description here of God saying, I'm going to give you the fashion, that I want you to make the ark. I'm going to tell you how tall it is, how wide it is, how long it is, and then I want you to cover it within and without with some type of substance. There it was gold. Back here it's pitch. And it's very similar. But the critics want to jump at Genesis 6, but not Exodus 25. And it's given to us purposely in very similar language. So that we'll see that if you believe in the historicity of the Ark of the Covenant, why not believe in the historicity of the Ark of Noah? Amen. Now this ark is a lot bigger, though. That was only 1.5 cubits over there. You get back to verse 15 here, 300 cubits. Now you start getting to the length here, and then that begins to bother some people. Now you need to recognize right away this thing is as long as 1.5 football fields. In high school, if you've ever had to run the 100-yard dash, that is a long way from one goal line to the other goal line. Evidently no one's ever had to run that. I didn't get any amens on that. Amen. Now when you run from one goal line to another, then run half that distance again. And there's how long this structure is. Now that's what bothers people right away. They say, how in the world, assuming this is as long ago as it really was, how in the world could man in his primitive state like that have built a structure like this structure? Now, I believe the football field's 50 yards wide. This isn't that wide. This is only half that. But it's 1.5 times the length of the football field. So you got it very long and you got it very narrow. But they seem to forget, what about things like the step pyramid and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and even Stonehenge back in England? Stonehenge is thousands of years old. And we believe we know why, but how did they build Stonehenge? Those stones weighed hundreds of tons. And you just don't go lifting those things over your head like that. Now, if you know what I'm talking about, it's a huge circle there, and stones, magnificent stones, were placed up on top of other ones. What about the Colossus of Rhodes and the Lighthouse of Egypt and all these other great things that we've had built in the past? You see those pyramids over there in Egypt, those weren't built in Abraham's day, 2000 B.C. Those were built many centuries before that time by earlier pharaohs. That's pushing us back closer and closer to the time of Noah, when they were able to accomplish feats like this. Now, you see, we would admit right away this would have taken tremendous architectural and design skills to be able to make a structure like this. Building a building like this, some of you could do that. How many of you here think you could make something like that? Now, not just the physical construction, but the genius that would have to go behind that in constructing something like that. You're going to be holding all the animals of the world in that boat. And you've got to keep them, as well as yourself, safe and alive. Now, can you imagine how long some of the beams are going to be on that? 300 cubits long. That's another problem there. They say, why? You've only got 4 people back then. 4 men. They forget the 4 women. Some women can be strong. We've got 8 people. They always say we only had 4 men to lift those heavy beams. I always say we got 8 people to lift those heavy beams. And that doesn't count all the hired help Noah and his friends could have. You see, you got to think about this and get the picture in your mind of this structure. It is not a fishing boat. This thing takes up an entire football field. And Noah is the one responsible for putting this thing together so that it'll stay together. Sure, he's given how long it's supposed to be, but that doesn't really help you. The longer that it is, the harder it's going to be to make then. That's great that he got the dimensions and he was supposed to make it out of gopher wood and pitch it within and without. But that's just a very bare minimum of the details that you would need to know to be able to put something like that together. It's interesting if you look over in Exodus again in chapter 31, you see these people that built things like the Hanging Gardens, and they used hydraulic pumps. And we're talking about several thousands of years ago. And of course, how are you going to get the water up to the top of the Hanging Gardens? Well, they knew about the science of hydrology. They had hydraulic pumps to pump that water up to the very top of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The thing to keep in mind is that these were unregenerate men that built things like the pyramids. And pretty bright. Because the pyramids have been constructed in such a way that they are perfectly matched together within a fraction of a degree. Counting for the wear and tear on the material where you've got fragments here and there, those pyramids in the very beginning were a perfect building. Where we can't even get things like that done today. You try to put 2 boards together and you end up with a big gap between them. And see, when you're adding this many stones on top of each other, you can't end up with too many gaps, so you'll never get a pyramid built in. You've got to have everything cut to such a precision that it matches perfectly together. Now, this boat's not going to have a bunch of branches stuck out all on the side of it. It has to match and work perfectly together. How did they saw all those trees down? You see, that presupposes something else you need to see that presupposes is that the earth has been here quite some time in order to end up with trees that large from which you're going to get your lumber. It's going to take tremendous beams to put a boat like this together. You don't just put that together with 2x4s. You're going to have tremendous beams of lumber and get them sawed just right to put this boat together. And that's going to take thousands of years for the earth to have already been here to have those trees grow to that type of height and girth and strength to be able to be used for Noah's Ark. But over here in Exodus 31, verses 1 to 3, if we have a problem with primitive man being able to construct such an ark, we see that outside even of the possibility of just natural man being able to do it, God could put supernatural wisdom in someone's heart. Verse 1, the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, See, I have called by name Bezaleel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship.
Hallelujah.
Now there's a possibility. All we need to see is a verse for a possibility. I would have to admit right away that that's going to be a tremendous feat for Noah and his sons to be able to do. Not so much the construction of it, but the genius that goes behind the construction on how to do it and how to lay everything out. All we're given is just some general measurements and some general details and a general blueprint of what this ark is to look like. So it's going to take someone extremely bright in the area of architecture to be able to put this thing together. So outside of the realm of just natural man being able to enter such an endeavor as the construction of Noah's Ark, we've got the possibility of God giving him supernatural wisdom, understanding, and knowledge in the area of building this ark so that it could be put together in exactly the manner that it would need to be in order to withstand the water. Remember, when you got it raining like that for 150 days and the water stays for another 221 days, then you're going to have a boat that is extremely, extremely strong. Any type of little flimsy structure simply would not do out there. You have to think of these things ahead of time. I mean, there are boats just out on just the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, you can have 20-foot waves out there sometimes, and it'll smash a modern boat to pieces out there. You've got to have a well-built boat to be able to withstand those waves. Of course, some of them still can't withstand. They capsize. So that's why the ark is built in a certain way, so that it's next to impossible to cause the boat to turn over. Well, let's go back to Genesis 6, verses 14 through 16. I think I've said before that it wasn't until the middle of last century that a boat was built that had the length of the ark. Of all the boats that have been built by the Norsemen and by the Greeks and by the Romans and by the Babylonians, it wasn't until just 150 years ago that we had a boat that was built anywhere near the size of the ark. Down in verse 15, 300 cubits, that's around 450 feet long. As I say, that's a long boat. And it wasn't until the middle of last century that we got a boat that built that size. And of course, since then, we've just gone on and on. The Queen Mary is 118 feet long, or 1,018 feet long, which is more than twice the length of the ark. Now that, of course, really gets to be a big boat. And it's interesting, since we see the Queen Mary exists, and it was 1,018 feet long, a boat like that could be built. I mean, it's not an impossibility. It's interesting that God didn't tell Noah to build a boat that long. In other words, the size of the boat must have been the right size in order to hold the animals that were needed on board. Because he could have said build one 1,018 feet long, the size of the Queen Mary. Must not have needed that much space, in other words. People have all types of misconceptions in their minds. Well, the first thing we need to look at is the actual word for the ark itself. It only appears in Genesis 6 to 9 and in Exodus 2. All of the places of the Old Testament, this Hebrew word never appears. Wherever you see ark again, such as Ark of the Covenant, it's a different Hebrew word. It appears a number of times in chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9 of Genesis. The only other place it's found is in Exodus chapter 2, verses 3 to 5. And the word basically means a chest or a coffin. So the first thing you need to get out of your mind is the idea that Noah's Ark was a ship or that it was a boat. It was neither one of those things. If we use that word, it's just because that's the common word. But it was not a ship. The Ark was not a ship. The Ark was not a boat. The Ark was a chest or a coffin or a box. That's what the word means. Now, the only other place the word is used, and you see you have to run the references to see if your other passages will somehow enlighten your initial passage. We are given some enlightenment over in Exodus 2, verses 3 through 5, on the nature of the ark. Because this is the only other place where this word appears. Verse 3, you've got a man of Levi and a daughter of Levi, descendants that is. When she could no longer hide him, this is Moses, she took him an ark of bulrushes, the same word as the word back in Genesis 6. She took him an ark of bulrushes, which of course we know, as we've shown you before, to be papyri, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side, and when she saw the ark among the flags, then she sent her maid to fetch it. Now you know what he was put in, or maybe you don't. You can at least tell from the language here, just a box here, a box of bulrushes that was sealed with this slime and pitch, in the same manner that the ark back in Genesis 6 was sealed. And you don't think of this being a boat or a ship that he's put in here. But it does use the word ark, the same one for Noah's Ark, which shows that it's not a ship, it's not a boat at all. It's nothing but a box. Now in the New Testament, we've got, of course, a different word, a Greek word, which means the same thing. It doesn't mean a boat in the New Testament. The word in the New Testament also means a box or a chest. And I think we see it appearing about 4 times. First of all, in Matthew 24. And verse 38. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the box. I mean, that's the way you could translate the word. Until the day that Noah entered into the box, or into the chest. Knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Luke 17:27. They did eat, they drank, they married wives. They were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the chest. The flood came and destroyed them all. Then over in Hebrews 11 and verse 7, we are immediately presented with a different conception of Noah's Ark when you read what the word actually means into the passage, and instead of calling it the ark, which you will always think of as a boat or as a ship, you put in box or chest or coffin. Verse 7 of Hebrews 11. By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared a coffin to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. Then finally in 1 Peter 3 and verse 20. As a matter of fact, it's interesting that the word can mean coffin. We get a spiritual understanding of the fact that, in effect, that's what they're in. They're in a coffin going from one world to another world, going from one life to another life. Wow. That's how you get to the next world. I mean, the average person, there are other ways to get there, but that is the general way you get to the next world, is you go into a coffin. And then you come out of that coffin and you go into the next world. And it's interesting and it's significant, scripturally and biblically speaking, that the word simply means a coffin. They were dead while they were alive, in other words. I mean, for all practical purposes, without the promise and protection of God, they were dead in that boat. Turn back to Hebrews 11 in verse 12. I'm saying that in the same way that Paul is saying Hebrews 11:12, speaking of Abraham, a man a century old, who yet by faith can still produce the promised seed, and therefore sprang there even of one, and him as good as dead. Abraham, for all practical purposes, was dead. A man a century old, he can't produce children anymore. For all practical purposes, he's dead. And Paul calls him, Abraham was a man as good as dead. Now the same thing is true with Noah and his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives. Those 8 people, for all practical purposes, were dead. They were in a coffin. And they were going from one world to the next world, and from one life to the next life. 1 Peter 3:20. Which sometime were disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. This shows us that our interpretation of the 120-year period is correct. While the ark was a preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by the very substance that destroyed the whole world of his day. So the ark's not a boat, the ark's not a ship, it's a box, it's a chest. Spiritually, it is a coffin. They're placed in a coffin. God seals them in that coffin, as we see from chapter 7, and for all practical, understandable purposes, they are dead. They're there for a year. He buries them. They come out to a new life, to a new world, to a new existence after that. All right, back to chapter 6. What about the material used in constructing the box? Thou shalt make thee an ark of gopher wood. Very difficult, because that word appears nowhere else in the Bible, gopher wood. And some of your lexicons don't even attempt to give you a meaning of the word. Those that do will suggest either cedar or cypress. And it seems like the latter of these two is what is being referred to here, because it's a very light and durable wood, and it was used by the Phoenicians, it was used by Alexander the Great to make his great fleet in Babylon. The doors of St. Peter's Church in Rome are made out of cypress. They were made 1,000 years ago. So you see it's a very durable wood, and it's still around today. So if you visit St. Peter's, you can look at the doors, and they were made 1,000 years ago, made out of cypress wood. So this is what the Phoenicians, if you remember during the time of David and Solomon, they always had to go to the Phoenicians to get help in building their ships and in building their temples. You see, it's a misconception to think that the Israelites built the temple of Solomon. They didn't build the temple. The Phoenicians built the temple. And the figures in the temple and the masonry and the stonework and the construction of the temple is not Israelite, because, you see, the Israelites aren't known for anything except being people of the book. They're not known for their poetry. They're not known for the great athletes. They were never known for their literature. They were never known for their sculpture. You see, all your ancient societies have had great epics and great periods when they were known for things like this. Israel was never known for any of that. For constructing things, what did they have to construct? Nothing. Because, you see, they don't have great temples to their gods that they had to build.
That's right.
So they're not known for any of these things. All they are known for is the people of the book. They were religious people that had a book. And they knew their book and they believed their book, those that were conservative and orthodox, but they didn't know how to do anything else except be shepherds and be people of a book. And that's why God kept them forever in that humble state, so that they wouldn't get to thinking about how they could compete with the Romans and with the Greeks and with the Assyrians in a lot of the technological skills that these other ancient societies and civilizations could do. Because Israel was never known for anything except a religious people basing their whole life, natural and spiritual, on this book, their Old Testament or their Bible. So they had to, what I'm saying is during the time of David and Solomon, they had to go to the Phoenicians in order to get help to build their boats and even during the time of Jehoshaphat, there was an alliance with the Phoenicians to build the boats, the ships of Tarshish down in Ezion-Geber at Elath, there on the Gulf of Aqaba. And during Solomon's time, the construction of the temple, they go up there, and the Phoenicians are the one who cuts the cedar trees of Lebanon down and floats them down on rafts to Joppa, and they bring them inland to Mount Moriah, and the Phoenicians are the one who are helping them in the construction, the cutting of the stones, and everything else. So this is what the Phoenicians used to build their boats, cypress wood. So this is probably what Noah is using here. So we've got his box made of cypress wood. Very light, but very, very durable. Big cypress trees.
Amen.
We just don't have them around like they used to have them. I mean, we don't hardly have anything around like they used to have except sin. Sin is still around like it's always been around.
Amen.
But we don't have anything like we used to have it around on the earth. So make thee a box of cypress wood, nests, bird nests, nests or cells. It's really not room, the word is nests. Shalt thou make in the box.
For the continuation,
Cypress wood, nest, bird nest, nest or cells. It's really not room, the word is nest. Shalt thou make in the box. Now there were just hundreds of these nests or cells inside of the box or inside Noah's Ark, and they served basically two purposes. First of all, they served the purpose of storage for the box. And secondly, they served a very important purpose for the bracing of Noah's Ark. Now, someone who had dreamed up this story might not have thought of the details that are needed. If you've got something this long and you've got something this wide, you've got to have support. You've got to have brace in the middle of it. I mean, even in little buildings, you have to have foundations somewhere in the middle. And it wouldn't do just to run a couple of rafters and a couple of poles across to hold that roof up and to hold the sides together and to hold the whole thing together. You've got hundreds of these little nests or cells constructed throughout the whole box, and the more of these you get, you see they've got walls to it, partitioning. What it did was partition into various storage areas the entire inside of the box of Noah's Ark, and the more of these you have, the more of a framework, the more of a bulwark, the more stability that you're going to have here. Now, I think let's see, what do you have there? Well, you've got nests in your margin there. Yeah. It's really not rooms, it's nests. We'll say more about that. We're not saying everything we can, but most of what we're going to say now. But we'll say more about that later. And thou shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. Now this is the Hebrew word kopher, K-O-P-H-E-R. And it's never translated pitch except here in Genesis 6. You see, we're coming across several different words that are never found anywhere else or never translated anywhere else as we're finding them here in Genesis 6, which shows that we've got a very important passage before us. How do you think that word is translated everywhere else where it's used? Kopher. Kippur. Does that sound more like it? The same thing. Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur. What's Yom Kippur? What's Yom? We studied that way earlier. Day. What's Kippur? Atonement. The Day of Atonement. That's the word used here. It's the word always translated atonement or reconciliation or forgiveness or covering. The word simply means covering everywhere else in the Old Testament. But here it's translated pitch. Now, no doubt the pitch was a bitumen substance. The Greek word in the LXX is actually asphalt. And it was probably some type of bitumen, B-I-T-U-M-E-N, a bitumen substance like asphalt that was used. And that's found elsewhere in the Old Testament when the word pitch occurs, such as in Exodus chapter 2, where we have pitch and where it is speaking of a bitumen substance. It's not the word kopher used there. It's the obvious word that we know means pitch. But here we've got a religious word used in a representative way. You again see the whole spiritual impact here. They are in a coffin, and the atonement in the Old Testament always was the covering over of the blood of the animal that covered over the sins of the people. Well, you've got the ark covered over within and without with the blood. It's atoned for within and without, which means that all the people inside the ark are covered with the blood. They are atoned for inside this. Now, I'm not getting some mystical meaning out of it. That's the only time this word is translated pig in the Bible. I mean, what if it said, and thou shalt atone it within and without with atonement? That's what the word means. That's not going to make a lot of sense then. Or even if it says, thou shalt cover it, since that's the basic root meaning of atonement. Atonement's an English word. That's not a Hebrew word. Covering is the Hebrew word. Atonement's an English word. Thou shalt cover it within and without with cover. That still wouldn't make any sense. That's why they have to give us pick. Because there actually was a pick substance used. But he's wanting to get across something more than just the physical, literal substance that was used. If that's all he wanted to get across, he'd simply use the common word that's used everywhere else in the Old Testament for pick. But he's wanting to get across a deeper spiritual meaning here, that not only is the boat covered within and without with a literal pick, but the people inside of it are covered in God's eyes, and they are protected. Now you've got that much contained right there in verse 14.
Praise the Lord.
I mean, that's a lot to find back there in old Noah's boat that he floated around in, that cracker box that he had. You've got several sermons there in Genesis 6:14. Okay, we'll go on into verse 15. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it up. The length of the box shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, the height of it 30 cubits. Now, taking the shorter cubit of 17 and a half or 18 inches, we end up with a length of 450 feet. We end up with a breadth of 75 feet. We end up with a height of 45 feet. So when you go from 300 by 50 by 30 cubits to feet, and we're being conservative, there were cubits up to 22 or 25 inches. And you're going to get a boat more like 700 feet long then. And it could have been that long, you see. But back then, it appears that the cubit being referred to and the cubit used was the shorter cubit, or the 18-inch cubit. Then you'd end up with this box 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. Now, I think I gave you this time. Let's cover it again. This is the floor space. It had a floor space of 95,700 square feet, which is equivalent to 20 basketball courts. It had a total volume of 1,396,000 cubic feet, which is equivalent to 522, to be precise, railroad boxcars. 1.396 million cubic feet. That would, of course, take up all the story. It had a gross tonnage of 13,960 tons. So here you've got something, it's the size, it has the square feet of 96,000 square feet. It's equivalent to 20 basketball courts. It's as long as a football field and half again. It's got 1.396 million cubic feet of volume and storage space, which equals 522 railroad boxcars. It has a gross tonnage of 13,960 tons. You've got something, if you're taking this the way God gives it, that simply couldn't point to anything but a universal flood. As a matter of fact, it's even been suggested, and there's a possibility, although we would have to make some minor arrangements in the figures that I just gave you as far as its gross tonnage and its square footage and its volume, square footage in floor space and its cubic footage in volume, that the ark might have had sloping sides, just gently, but sloping sides that would have gone up, not sloping sides down. That's what your modern boat has, you see, and that gives you speed. That's the streamlined effect. But just the reverse, sloping sides going up. This is the concept behind dams and dikes. You don't ever see a dam that's straight up and down, because then it has to withstand the full force of water that goes up against it. If you've got a sloping side, then you've got the water more or less rolls up it and then rolls back down. Now, if you've got, I'm not saying it had to be this way, I'm just saying it has been suggested by some people, that if it had slightly sloping sides upwardly, it wouldn't have to be that much. But anything different from just a straight-on effect, that would keep the water rolling up the sides and rolling back down the sides rather than a full impact against the side of the boat. Now that would just be tremendous. Remember, these storms that we talked about that you have out at the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean they're just a little rain shower compared to what it would be like when the fountains of heaven, the windows of heaven and the fountains of the great deep broke up.
Amen.
I mean, you've got just whirlpools and torrents of water. Now, over in chapter 7 and verse 20, the 15 cubits, as we said last time, appears to be how deep the ark sunk in the water, which would have been half of its height. 15 of the 30 cubits would have been 22 and a half of the 45 feet as far as how tall or how high the ark was, or the box was. When the ark was fully loaded, then it's going to sink, in other words, half its height into the water. And the deeper you can get a boat to sink in water, the lower the place, the center of gravity, and the lower the center of gravity, the more impossible it is to get the boat to capsize. That's probably why we're given this figure over in chapter 7 and verse 20. Because what you want to do with the boat during the storm is to lower the center of gravity. If you've got the material where you can do that, is to lower the center of gravity. And if you lower the center of gravity, then you are decreasing the possibility or the probability of it capsizing, because you've got so much of it already under the water. How can you capsize something that's already under the water then? And it gets down so low, then you don't have as much side space for the water to be able to pound against. All you've got now is 15 cubits, or 22 and a half feet. I mean, that's still high for something to be hitting against that, but it's not nearly as bad as having 45 feet. You see, if you had the ark and it was 100 feet high, well, something like that's going to turn over then. It's just sticking up too high out of the water. You want to get it to sink down in the water and lower the level of gravity then. You're going to have a boat that's very stable. You're going to have a craft there that's going to be able to withstand some tremendous waves and some tremendous pressure against it. Now down in verse 16, we come up with some more interesting things. Many versions don't even have the word window here. You might have one that does. As a matter of fact, most of them don't. Most of them have the word roof in here for window. But that's really not right either. The whole first phrase in the first part of this verse is the most difficult thing to translate. It's next to impossible to translate, but I can give you the meaning of what's being said here. This is in the first half of verse 16. Now let's just take it the way we've got it here in the Authorized Version and see if you understand what it's saying. A window shalt thou make in the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. You got any idea what that means? It doesn't say what it means. That's about the best way they can translate it without paraphrasing. You see, if you paraphrase it, then it's all right. You can end up with a good meaning and understanding. What does it mean, a window shalt thou make in the ark, and the cubit shalt thou finish it above? What's the it, and above what shalt thou finish it? The obvious meaning, the obvious literal meaning of what you've got in the Authorized Version is a window that's a cubit square. You've got a window that's 18 inches wide, that's 18 inches tall. This is not what he's saying, though. In chapter 8 and verse 6, remember the window that he opened to let the birds out? That's a different Hebrew word. These aren't the same windows here. Look over in chapter 8 and verse 6. Came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah open the window of the ark which she had made. You got to cross-reference back to chapter 6, where that's a wrong reference because the Hebrew words are two entirely different words for window here. Now, you've got window both of the times in the English. And window is meant here in chapter 8 and verse 6. Here we go again with one of these unusual words back here in 6:16. The word that's translated window is always translated noon everywhere else in the Old Testament. Noon, 12 o'clock noon. It's always the word translated noon. All right, let's see if that makes any more sense. A noon shalt thou make in the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. I would say we're worse off now. I mean, at least I know how to make a window, but I don't know how to make a noon, though. But that literally is what you've got there. A noon shalt thou make in the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. Like I say, it's something difficult to translate, and we've just got a terrible translation. And I'm not going to even try to translate it because it's too difficult, but I'm going to explain what it is. It doesn't even mention the word roof here. But as I said, that's what most versions give for the word window. You won't even find window there. It just simply gives the word for roof. And it says, a roof shalt thou make to the ark, and in the cubit shalt thou finish it above. And that really doesn't help anything there. But what you need in there is a noon, but just putting that in there, you're still in trouble because it doesn't explain what's being said. We've got the translation, but not the explanation of what's being said. What he means here is you're to have an opening for light. That's what again, the word noon is used in a metaphorical sense. I mean, we've got a lot of words used here in a metaphorical, symbolical, representative sense. What it means is you're to make an opening for light that extends from the bottom of the roof down 18 cubits. Or down 1 cubit, 18 inches. So you've got the roof of the ark, and underneath the roof, now whether the roof has an overhang or not, that's one thing we're not told. We're assuming that it does have some type of overhang to protect too much water from coming in the window. Assuming it's got some type of overhang, which would be the only thing that it should have, is something to protect the windows there, or to protect this opening for light, then all the way around the entire top of the ark, you've got nothing, you don't have a window that's a square, you've got it a cubit, 18 inches, but it has no end to it. You see what I'm saying? It would go all the way around the whole top to give you light on all sides. And that's why he's going to use the word noon. It's just like the noon sun can come in from all directions there. Now, it's a different word, as I say, from what's used in chapter 8 and verse 6. And this particular opening for light, it's really not a window. All it means is an opening for light. When it says, a cubit shalt thou finish it above, that just really doesn't say anything. But you're to make it, it's to only be 18 inches from top to bottom. But obviously you're not going to put that down, let's say, 10 feet from the bottom of the ark, because that's underwater there. It has to be above 15 cubits from the bottom of the ark up, because that's how low the ark dropped in the water. And if you put it up 20 cubits from the bottom, then you're going to have waves coming in at there. So the only thing that we can assume is that what he's getting across here is to put the window, or put this opening for light, as high in the side of the ark as you can place it. And the highest place to place this opening for light would be right underneath the roof. So the cubit mentioned here in verse 16, or this 17.5 or 18-inch length or height, would be extended from the bottom of the roof down. You all understand what I'm saying there? So you're going to have this thing going all the way around. Now this is to serve for two purposes. First of all, or two purposes that I'm going to share for now. First of all, as an obvious source of light. You've got no light in the ark whatsoever until you get this placed in there. Now, if this is a window that is 1 cubit square, and you've got something that's 450 feet long, just one person can sit there and get some light in. So obviously, it's not one window that's a cubit square. it means that it's going all the way around the top, which means that you've got light all the way around, but most of the light is going to be confined to the top floor now. Remember, you've got 2 more floors that would be underneath it. And if you're placing this just below the roof, then for the most part, most of the light, not all of it though, as we'll show you, but most of the light is going to be restricted here to this top floor. So a source of light is its first purpose. A second purpose is the purpose of ventilation.
Amen.
Got to have some ventilation in there with all the world's animals. I didn't bring my book again this time. Do you remember the picture that I showed you last time of someone's conception? And they had up on top of the ark that we don't know about that now. That's not said here. That's not even hinted at here. That is someone's conception that we'll say more about later. But we're assuming for now that that's not true, because there's no way to prove that. When it says that you're going to make it this cubit shalt thou finish it above, and we know that it's going to have to be referring to that roof, and we're going to have some type of overhang over it to keep the water out of it. Remember, you've got rain pouring in. If you just had those holes up there on the top, you're going to have rain just pouring in through those things then we're going to just assume that what I've said is the best thing, is the closest that we can get to it right now. Now, I'll be the first to admit I wasn't there, so I'm not an authority on Noah's Ark. All I'm saying is what the Bible is saying. And it could have had wheels on it. I don't know what it had on there. I didn't see it. So I'm never going to put myself in the position of the critics, whom I always criticize, who want to tell us what prevailed on that side of the flood, and we weren't there. So we don't know. All we can go by is what God's given us here in His Word. And try to get some type of idea from it. Now I want to make another comment back on chapter 8 and verse 6 before we go on. And that is, this window, since it's a different word, and this window you could close. Now obviously the opening for light in chapter 6, you can't close that. It just stays open because, it's just open all the way around. This is a window you can close here. So this is a different window now in chapter 8 and verse 6. Came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window, which means that it had shutters that closed from the inside out and that were locked or bolted or latched from the inside. Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. What I've seen from this that's very interesting is the fact that this is a particular item of detail concerning the construction of the ark that were not given back in chapter 6, verses 14 to 16. We're given most of the information there. As a matter of fact, we're given all the information that we know from reading the text, with the exception of chapter 8 and verse 6. What that points to is the fact that there were probably other structures, there were other details to the boat that we simply don't know. They don't have to be recorded back here in chapter 6 to have been given to Noah. Because very obviously, Noah was given chapter 8 and verse 6. He was given the command to put this window in so that he could let the birds out later on. But notice that it's not given back here in chapter 6 in the description of the ark. So evidently there were some other things, and some of those other things are some things that I'm going to suggest later. And we're going to come back to that text and remind you of it. That's the only text that we have so that we can at least base a presupposition or an assumption on that there were other structural features in the ark that we're not told about. Because of the fact that this window is not given to us in the chapter 6 account, it's only mentioned in passing in chapter 8. Okay, so we'll come back to that if you don't understand all that, but I believe there were some other things also in the ark, in the structure of the ark, that we're not told about here in chapter 6. Okay, let's go back to verse 16. Now you've got the picture of an opening for light that would go all the way around. Now it doesn't have to be intercepted with bars so many cubits along the way, or pieces of wood, because the roof of the ark could be supported by the cells or by the nest, you see. So you could have a complete opening that wouldn't have any bars or any pieces of wood that would have to serve as a undergirding for the roof, because you've got all on the inside of the ark the walls of the nest or the cells that could support. So it would simply give you a clear view. I mean, you could stick your arm out, in other words, and walk all the way around the top of it, never have to pull it in. There'd be nothing there, which increases the possibility for light and the availability of ventilation. Okay, verse 16, the middle of verse 16. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. We're just looking at each one of the features that we're provided with here. So we've got a door. It is placed in the side, not at one of the ends, in the side. Probably it was placed so that it would open into the first story. Generally you see it in pictures opening to the second story, and you've got a huge plank that you've got to go up to get into the right in the middle of it. That's probably not feasible. And let me tell you why. Probably what you've got is a door, and I can prove that it happened like this, that it didn't open like you open a door, it folded out like a gangplank or like a walkway and laid down on the ground. Now we're not told any of this. All we're told right here is that we've got a door of the ark, thou shalt set in the side thereof. It goes on to tell us about the stories here in a moment. Assuming that it does open into the first story rather than into the second or third, it would be into the first story that you kept your large animals, and then you're probably going to have other planks and other gangways that you wouldn't have steps or anything like that. You're going to have a walkway that would go from the first floor to the second floor and one from the second floor to the third floor. And of course you'd keep your larger animals downstairs. You want your weight in the bottom of the box in the first place. In the second place, you don't want them walking up a half a dozen planks to get up to the top of the boat. You'll take all the smaller things up there. If you look over in chapter 7 and verse 16, now this would have to be a very large door to get some animals through there now, because we've got some large dinosaurs that had to get on board Noah's box. So it's going to be a very large door, not one of these little things that you open and close. A huge opening here in the side that where you'd have a door that would fall out to you. Now I can prove that that's the way it opened from verse 16. And they that went in male and female of all flesh, as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. Why? Because you couldn't close the door yourself if you're on the inside. You could only close the door from the outside. They go to chapter 8 and verse 13. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering, it's the same thing, the door of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. It was bolted from the inside. It could be opened from the inside by simply removing the bolt, pushing it out. It would fall and hit the ground, and you would have a gangplank that would lead from the ark down to the ground. But you couldn't close it yourself. So we're given this hint back in verse 16 of chapter 7. It had to have this type of structure because it says that God shut him in. People get all types of mystical notions about why it says God shut him in. Well, it's telling us why he shut him in, and that's why he's giving us that, to show that this is the type of door that had to be there in order for the animals to get in. Noah couldn't have closed it by himself, because it's going to have to be heavy if it's going to be a part of the side of the box, and if it's going to be supporting so many animals. And then we get from chapter 8 and verse 13 that Noah himself was able to unbolt the door and push it out, and it would serve as the gangplank out. Now, the only other thing we have back in chapter 6 and verse 16 is the story. You've got 3 of these. These also serve 2 purposes, as the cells did. First of all, for storage area, and secondly, for the bracing of the box. Because there you've got things that run sideways, whereas the stories, you're going to have walls that run vertically. And if you've got stories, then you're going to have floors that are going to be running horizontally, which will give support to the ark sideways. Okay, I think we better stop there. That's pretty much through on a description of the ark. We didn't get to the animals yet, but we're going to start talking about Noah and the gathering of the animals, the collection of the animals, the care of the animals while they're there in the ark. Do we have any questions?
question I had by talking about that opening, because I keep reading, or going through Genesis 6, 7, and 8, just to try to see what's more is in there. But I had a question, is how they, in chapter 8 and verse 5, and it says, and were the tops of the mountain seen? And I had a vision of just this one little window that they had, when I see that they had that opening all the way around the top, that the tops of the mountains could be seen.
Right.
All that were in there.
Right.
So that, it just opened up a verse.
Yeah. Yeah, the more you see, the more you understand about its construction, the more you can set yourself back in that time with Noah and see actually what was going on there. Yeah.
You feel that the light from coming in from the window would go all the way down to even the first floor by
Right. Right. You see, it would go down the walkways and the planks. That's what would give you light downstairs, but not nearly as much as you'd have upstairs. Yeah, you see, all those things are answered if you just think about it. Then you've got all your problems and questions answered there about the construction of this tremendous thing.
Are you going to cover how the animals are kept in the vault or they?
Yeah. We'll be getting to some more of these things next time. Then we start looking. We'll look at for probably several weeks here at the animals themselves and their storage and their care while they're on the ark. Because we did have some things to get to here in the end of chapter 6, but I didn't get to it. Okay, so you see that takes us 14, 15, and 16, which are the three major verses here in the account that give us the details of what the ark looked like. Then in verse 17, then he starts telling him some more things, so we'll begin with that next time.